If you could just indulge me for a minute, I would like to ask everyone in the audience who is 25 years of age or younger to stand up for a minute. Okay. That's quite an impressive crowd. I'm sure you're feeling a bit of power in numbers. If you were in Egypt or if you were Egyptian, 2 years ago you probably would have been out on the streets demonstrating, because half of the population is under the age of 25, and you would have been demonstrating against a dictator who had been in power your entire life. So that is quite a phenomena. Those of you who are still sitting, I'm excluding you for a reason, and that is because if you were in Egypt, you might have had something to do with the former regime, and you wouldn't be allowed to run for elective office. And so I'd like to ask everyone who is, or to remain standing, who has ever thought about running for office or would have wanted to run for the congressional elections or the elections in Egypt. Oh. Okay. Do I have anyone still standing? Wow, okay. I was going to go through a few things of office or being a minister or drafting a constitution, but that was reduced rather quickly. Well, okay. What I would like to talk about then is how you go from a mass mobilization of a social revolution to to a representative democracy. How do you go from something where everyone or a large percentage of the people are in the streets and participating in something to a very small number of people who are willing to shoulder that responsibility? And I need to look further outside of the room because I don't have anyone to shoulder that responsibility. But how do you go from something like this to something like this, and to an election that leads to this and representative democracy? This is Tunisia, and this is Egypt. How do you go from a military transition to civilian government? How do you do that transfer, and how do you make sure that that's going to happen? In Libya, as Josh was just saying, it's virtually amazing that there were elections in Libya after 41 years, that Gaddafi was actually pushed out of power. But how do you go from this, from his compound, that's a picture I took myself in Tripoli, to an elected parliament, and what are the steps in order to do that? Well, I would like to argue that, in fact, the revolution that we all saw on TV and on Facebook and Twitter is not actually it is a revolution, and it's an important revolution, but the real revolution is actually taking place now in terms of redefining the institutions of the state and the social contract between the government and the citizens, and how that relationship is managed. It's not only elections, although I work in elections, but it's political parties. How do you have a functioning parliament? And how do you go from the euphoria of a revolution to something that is not quite as clean? And writing a constitution and redefining that relationship of governance. Now, I'm the first person to say that I actually don't have all the answers. I've been watching it a long time, and I feel like the more that I know, the more that I don't know. To paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, he said that there were some known unknowns, things that we know that we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns, things that we don't even know that we don't know. And I don't think that anyone could have predicted this transition. And I don't know that anyone can really predict with any reasonable certainty where the transition is headed. But I can give you some observations over my years of watching things in the region and in the countries. Primarily, I've worked on Tunisia and Libya, but also Egypt and some of the other countries that have experienced change over the last few years, Morocco, Algeria, and give you a few things to think about in terms of the transition and how it will be successful. And the first one is that it is inherently messy. Under an authoritarian dictator, things are pretty stable. You might not like it very much, but at least there is some security and things are more or less, you know what to expect. Well, right now, there are lots of people in the region who are wondering whether or not this was a good thing. And in fact, their lives may have changed, but maybe not for the better. And they now have huge expectations of government that the government might not be able to fulfill. So, you could even argue that the revolutions have had a negative impact on people because tourism is dropping, the economy is plummeting, and you have governments that are now in place that are under pressure to to manage these things that are short-term problems while they're really trying to figure out what the long-term plan is. And there is, that leads into my next point, which is that there was no long-term plan. Mubarak never intended to give up power. Gaddafi never did. Ben Ali left pretty quickly, but I'm sure he didn't intend to. And there was no real roadmap. So all of these countries are trying to figure out, as they go along, what that roadmap will be. And we're figuring out now how that works, how those governments are able to function and concentrate on things. And sometimes it's in ways that we don't expect. So in Tunisia, for example, the National Constituent Assembly was elected to draft a constitution. But a few weeks into their work, they decided that their mandate should also include governing and legislative powers. And so within a few months, they said, well, our calendar is going to be 2 days a week on the Constitution and 2 days a week on legislative issues and 2 days a week on special issues, which basically means that it's reduced from a body that was supposed to draft a constitution to only working on that 8 days a month. That was not anticipated, but it was probably needed. In Egypt, up until the last moment before with the presidential elections, it was uncertain whether or not the armed forces or the SCAF would hand over power to the elected officials. And in Libya, there had not been a history of elections or even institutions. Political parties had been banned. And now we have a newly elected Congress that is unfortunately feeling a lack of legitimacy even in the powers that it was elected to have in terms of selecting the people that would be drafting the new constitution. So they're all trying to figure their way through this, and even some things that we thought that we learned in other countries could be repeated. For example, in Iraq, we had the de-Baathification, and everyone looked back on that later and said, oh, that was horrible. All these people who actually knew something, we threw them all out. Well, in Libya right now, they are discussing a political isolation law that, if it is voted on in the Congress, would actually result in the exclusion of some of those very people who are voting on it from holding elective office later. It would cover everyone that held any sort of position in the Gaddafi regime back to 1969. And that includes people who fled the regime in the 80s, the president of the Congress, other very high elected officials, and many of the secular politicians. So what works in one might not work in another. It might be a model, it might be something that they follow, it might not be something that they choose to follow. So that is another issue that we have to take into account, that they have their own sovereign decision-making. They not only they don't have a roadmap, but they also have to define the terminology of what they're talking about. And when you get politicians together to talk about this, it's not always clear. So when you're talking, for example, about drafting a new constitution, And things that you thought might have been clear in terms of, for example, the role of Sharia in the Constitution and how it should be referred to. Well, it turns out that there's about 5 different ways of referring to it. That you could say that it forms the basis of all laws. You could say that it is laws that are based on the principles of Sharia, the concepts of Sharia, and all of these things would have a different meaning as to what people expect will happen from that and flow from that. And so those issues are all under debate. It's also the terminology of just the technical terms. If you're writing a constitution and you're defining the electoral system, if you're talking about something between semi-presidential and semi-parliamentarian, what does that mean? What is the balance of powers between a president and a parliament? And what I've come to know or come to realize is that many times it is largely defined by the negative. It's what they know that they don't want. So in Tunisia, for example, they do not want a strong president. They don't want to have a French model of the Fifth Republic with a strong presidential model, but they also don't want to have a figurehead president, and they want to have something that's in between the two. And then, but what does that mean? So if I say that I favor a semi-presidential and someone else favors a semi-parliamentarian, it's figuring out what those terms actually do mean. And there's even things that I would think would be obvious, like universal human rights. Well, they had a big discussion as to whether or not universal human rights should be in the preamble of the Tunisian constitution, because some people thought that the universality of human rights was actually more of a Western concept, and that would be in contradiction with Tunisian morals, and that those things were not compatible. But which to me seems like a contradiction in and of itself. It's, if they're universal, then how could they be contrary? So it's figuring out those terms. And then again, who should be actually drafting this Constitution? If you elect a body, then those people have distinctly different profiles than people who are selected. So in Egypt, they selected a body of people, and in Tunisia, they elected the body. And you have this big debate between the two of whether or not the body in Egypt, that the 100 people that actually drafted the Constitution were representative. And the secularists actually pulled out of the Constitution drafting. So now they really don't feel that they were represented, and they're talking about reopening it again. So it's a question of who should do that. And after months of drafting in Tunisia, you came to this position where some of the people who were elected to draft it have now said, actually, it might have been a better idea to have a technical expert draft this and for us to review it instead of us to draft the whole thing. It would have been a much cleaner process. But in the end, the one other thing that I think is really, and also kind of counterintuitive, is whether or not this process needs to be participatory. And you've gone from this massive demonstration where everyone is involved to a very small number of people who are controlling things and drafting a constitution, and that's usually the norm. But from a liberal democratic perspective and tradition, I feel instinctively that it should be participatory, and the Carter Center has put out statements saying that it should be, and that they should put that out for dialogue, and that everyone should understand what's in the Constitution. And that is true, but if you do that, then it can be reopening issues that you thought were decided and are not necessarily, that are then where you had this delicate wording and you found a compromise, then is once again reopened for discussion. So those things are all quite difficult to manage. And I'm not claiming to give any of the answers, but I think in the end, what is very interesting to note of all of these processes is that while they are very similar, they're also they're not homogeneous. There's lots of differences between the countries and between the institutions that existed and those that didn't. And those also are having an impact, and things that we thought, oh, sorry, I forgot a few of the slides here. You need to define the terms and you need to create buy-in. Sorry. So they're not all homogeneous. You might not get the results that you anticipate. We might not, any of us, get the results that we anticipate. The people who first led the revolution in Egypt were younger secularists, Facebook, the Facebook generation, and we've ended up with the Islamists and the levers of power. So it's impossible to know exactly where these things are headed, but at the end of the day, I'm hopeful, and even now that the euphoria of the street revolution has subsided, I really am looking at this, we're looking at the long-term changes that are taking place, and I believe strongly that the real revolution will be in how they figure out how to bridge this gap, and something that is inherently not a participatory process and not as inclusive, and make it something that the citizens themselves can own and have that new relationship with the government. So thank you very much.